In May 1960, a single Sunday afternoon broke the Richter scale. Coastlines in 4 countries were drowned, and a sleeping volcano was awakened after more than 40 years. The Earth cracked open for almost 1,000 kilometers. It released more energy than 20,000 Hiroshima bombs. Fully 2 meters of Chile's coastline disappeared into the sea. 2 million people lost their homes. Before it was over, a separate disaster, triggered by the same seismic event, was already forming. Landslide debris dammed a lake, causing the water to quietly rise, primed to break loose on 100,000 people living downstream. No earthquake, before or since, has matched what happened that afternoon. This is the most powerful earthquake ever recorded. The west coast of South America sits on top of one of the most violent boundaries on the planet. The Nazca Plate, a slab of oceanic crust the size of a small continent, is sliding eastward, forcing itself under South America at about 80 millimeters a year. This collision is still building the Andes Mountains. It also generates earthquakes, more of them and larger than almost anywhere else on Earth. Tectonic plates don't slide smoothly. They lock. Immense pressure builds up. For decades, even centuries, the boundary will hold while strain accumulates along thousands of kilometers of buried rock. When it finally lets go, it doesn't fail in a single point. It tears apart like a seam. The coast between Talca and Chiloé Island hadn't released a major earthquake in more than 100 years. By 1960, the strain stored along that stretch of fault was enormous. On May 21st, 1960, the rupture finally happened. At 6:02 in the morning, a magnitude 8.1 earthquake hit Concepcion. Walls collapsed. At least 125 people died. Phone lines went down. Power was cut. The city went dark. Aftershocks rolled in continuously for the next 33 hours. Some were severe. People stopped sleeping inside their houses. They dragged mattresses into courtyards. They sat in the streets. They didn't trust the walls anymore. That instinct saved thousands of lives. Because the May 21st quake wasn't the disaster. It was the warning. The locked plate boundary had begun to unzip. What was coming was something seismology had no scale to measure. Sunday, May 23rd, 3:11 in the afternoon. After a day and a half, the aftershocks had begun to feel routine. Then, the ground moved differently. The rupture started 160 kilometers offshore and tore south along the subduction zone. For 10 minutes, the floor of southern Chile shook. Most strong earthquakes last under 1 minute. Some of the worst on record have lasted 3. Survivors in Chile were standing, or trying to stand, for 10. In Valdivia, nearly half of every building in the city was destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. Roads cracked open, bridges collapsed. The ground in some places dropped by 2 meters. Entire coastlines disappeared beneath the Pacific overnight. The marine navigation charts of southern Chile became permanently useless. The seismic instruments of 1960 couldn't measure what was happening. The shaking saturated their needles. The standard Richter scale, in use at the time, simply ran out of room. The real magnitude, 9.5, couldn't be calculated until years later, when scientists invented a new scale capable of describing it. The shaking was felt as far north as Seattle. The whole planet rang. Seismologists detected free oscillations of the Earth itself. the entire globe vibrating like a struck bell for days afterward. Hundreds were already dead. The sea was about to make it much worse. About 15 minutes after the shaking ended, the ocean withdrew. Boats settled into mud. Fish flopped on the bare sea floor. Some people, in a country with no living memory of a major tsunami, walked out to look at them. Then, the water came back. The first wave reached around 8 meters. A second wave, 10 minutes later, came in at 10 meters. In some bays, the geometry of the coastline focused and amplified the energy until the run-up reached 25 meters, over 80 feet of water rolling inland. Entire fishing villages, from Mocha Island in the north to the Isen region in the south, were swept away. Wooden houses were carried 2 miles inland and dropped in fields. Bodies were never recovered. In the village of Quenuir, at the mouth of the Moyenne River, a saying still survives in the local Spanish. The tsunami was so big, it took even the dead out of their graves. But this was only the start of the wave's journey. What had been displaced was so vast that the tsunami did something no tsunami had done before. It crossed the Pacific. Tide gauges as far away as the Atlantic and Indian Oceans picked up its signal. It was the first tsunami ever recorded globally. About 15 hours later, the waves reached Hilo on the big island of Hawaii. Sirens had sounded. The U.S. Coast Guard and Geodetic Survey had broadcast warnings for hours. But many residents had lived through the 1946 Aleutian Island tsunami, when the Waiakea Peninsula had been spared. They believed they'd be spared again. Some who evacuated to higher ground came back early to check on their houses. The waves crested at nearly 11 meters. The bay's geometry focused the energy exactly as it had on the Chilean coast. The waterfront was obliterated. The Waiakea district was so completely destroyed that it was never rebuilt. The city later turned the entire area into a memorial park. The force of debris in the water was strong enough to fold parking meters flat to the ground. 61 people died in Hilo. Almost all of them had been warned. Almost all of them had simply not believed the warning was real. 22 hours after the earthquake, the tsunami reached Japan. Along the Sanriku coast, waves up to 6 meters destroyed nearly 3,000 homes and killed 138 people. In the Philippines, 32 more were dead or missing. One earthquake, 4 countries. In a single day, a single fault movement had reached across over 1/3 of the planet. While the tsunami was still crossing the ocean, a different disaster was beginning inland. About 65 kilometers east of Valdivia, 3 massive landslides had broken loose during the shaking. They had torn down the slopes of Chalcan Mountain and slammed into the outlet of Renue Lake. The lake's only drainage, the San Pedro River, which flows west and eventually empties into Valdivia itself, was now blocked. Renue is the lowest of a chain of 7 connected lakes. Water from the entire system kept pouring in, with nowhere to go. The level began to rise, slowly, steadily, inevitably. Engineers ran the numbers. Every meter the water rose meant another 20 million cubic meters held back. If it ever topped the natural debris dam, almost 5 cubic kilometers of water would crash down the San Pedro River and reach Valdivia in under 5 hours. 100,000 people lived in the path. Valdivia, already half destroyed by the earthquake, was evacuated for the second time in a week. And then thousands of soldiers and workers from the Chilean state agencies, Endesa, Corfo, and MOP, went into the mountains and started digging. By hand, with shovels, with bulldozers where they could reach. They cut artificial channels through the landslide debris to lower the lake level in a controlled release, faster than the water was rising, while the water kept rising. The work took weeks. The lake rose 26.5 meters before the canals were finally cut, but they were cut in time. The release was managed. The dam did not break. The lakeside hamlet of Rinewe was flooded. The city downstream was saved. The operation became known as the Riniwazo. It is one of the more remarkable feats of civil engineering of the 20th century, accomplished almost entirely by men with hand tools, racing rising water in the rain. And while they were still digging, 38 hours after the main shock, and 240 kilometers east of the rupture zone, the Cordon Core volcano opened along a long fissure and threw an ash column 8 kilometers into the sky. It had been dormant since 1921. Scientists believe the stress released by the megathrust earthquake forced magma upward through fractures in the crust. The eruption continued for nearly 2 months. One earthquake, a trans-Pacific tsunami, a lake that nearly broke, a volcano that would not stop spewing, all from one fault movement. Before 1960, seismologists used the Richter scale. The Valdivia event broke it. The instruments saturated. The numbers stopped meaning anything. In response, the seismologist Hiroshi Kanamori and his colleagues developed the moment magnitude scale in the 1970s, which calculates an earthquake's size from the actual physical displacement of the fault rather than the amplitude of recorded waves. Applied retroactively to Chile, the figure came out at 9.5. It remains the largest moment magnitude ever assigned to an instrumentally recorded earthquake. No event in the more than 60 years since has matched it. The tsunami forced another change. In 1960, there was no coordinated international warning system. There was a station in Hawaii that had issued the warnings nobody in Hilo had believed. After 1960, that station was expanded into the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, a full international body with tide gauges, seismometers, and communication links throughout the Pacific Basin. When the 2010 Male earthquake struck Chile 50 years later, also megathrust, also along the same boundary, warnings reached most of the Pacific Rim within minutes. Plate tectonics itself was, in 1960, still a contested theory. Continental drift had been proposed decades earlier, but lacked a convincing mechanism. The Chile earthquake gave seismologists their best data set yet on what happens at a subduction zone. By the late 1960s, plate tectonics was no longer a hypothesis, it was the foundation of modern geology. The Nazca Plate is still pushing east. The southern Chilean coast has continued to subside in places. Inland regions have slowly rebounded. The exact stretch of fault that ruptured in 1960 is now considered locked again, building strain. Estimates of how many people died in southern Chile that week ranged to over 6,000. 2 million were left homeless. Coastal communities a hemisphere away were grieving people they'd never heard of, from a country some could not have found on a map. Every major figure used in modern seismology, magnitude, intensity, run-up, energy release, was either set or recalibrated by what happened that single Sunday afternoon in Chile. Indeed, our entire world is constantly in motion. These tectonic plates have not stopped moving. If you made it this far, thank you. These videos take a lot of time to put together, and every like, comment, and subscription genuinely helps keep them going. If you want more stories like this, consider supporting the channel. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next one.